All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the founder and the host of the Rise Above Justice Movement and the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. All right. So we are back with another edition to our candidate series. And by now, our listeners are probably tired of me saying that because there's a lot of candidates that have reached out, and it's so exciting. And I'm not tired of interviewing, I'm not tired of saying it. But I guess repetitive gets to be repetitive, but it's okay. We're going to push through. Technical difficulties this morning. We've had some massive storms that have been moving through and more to come because climate change exists, y'all. Just making that very, very clear. But today I am joined by Alex out of Massachusetts and deeply excited to sit down and talk with you about, who you are and why you're running at a time like now. I think it's important for progressive voices to be in office all across the country in all levels of government, all the way down to water board, to your county, your county commission, and all the way up to the U.S. Senate, like you are running for. So let's talk about that. Feel free to introduce yourself, give us a background on who you are and why you are running for the United States Senate.
Yeah, I'm Alex Rikleen. I'm running for U.S. Senate in Massachusetts. I'm trained as a history teacher. I was born and raised in Massachusetts. I grew up in our public schools. I went to Boston College. I'm a local volunteer. I chair the PTO at my kids' school. I've raised service dogs for seeing eye organizations. Uh, but I've been around the political scene, and I'm running for this seat because as I think many Americans around the country do, Democrats are not meeting this moment. Democrats are, you know, they, Democrats, especially in Washington, have picked a strategy for how they want to handle the Trump moment. Um, but it seems like they sort of picked that strategy in a cloistered room. We're not the first country to go through an authoritarian moment like this. We need to be learning from history and looking at what worked and what didn't. And when I look at the strategies currently being employed by this Democratic Party, I see way too much repetition of strategies that didn't work and not enough learning from what did work. And so I saw a Democratic Party that wasn't listening to its core voters saying, you need to be doing more right now. And that was just saying, no, we think we know better. We're going to pick a strategy of waiting and hoping that we win more seats in the long term, even if there's more that we could be doing to minimize harm right now. Um, and that appears to want to just go back to normal after Trump, but there's no normal to go back to anymore. Um, and I saw that as a huge problem, and I said, what we need to add to these large national voices, people with large audiences calling for people to do more, the organizing's already happening. 5051 was formed in a week to a large national movement. I thought what we needed to add to that was primary campaigns, and the bluer the seat, the more important those primary campaigns were. Um, because yes, we do need to win more seats, but we also need to send the message to Washington that what they're doing isn't good enough.
Exactly, 100%. I absolutely agree. And speaking of not doing enough, we see a lot of conversation going on around like ICE funding, right? And that's obviously a really big topic. We saw what happened in Minneapolis. I've mentioned it several times on this podcast, and I'll mention it again. Obviously, me and my mom sat and we watched the video of Alex Preddy, and I used to frequent that donut shop that had happened right in front of. I used to live in Minneapolis for a year and a half, and that is called Glam Doll Donuts. Huge shameless plug. They have some really good donuts. It's locally owned. And it's also just like a really adorable like store that is there. But I met somebody that I actually ended up kind of like door knocking for her at that time. And she was running for city council at the time. And I remember just sitting in there and, obviously watching that video very vividly. I cannot get it out of my mind. It is going to be distilled in my mind probably for the rest of my life. I'm never going to forget. That's something that you just cannot just get out of your head because I used to frequent there. I know
Yeah, of course.
exactly that exact same spot that he was murdered in. I know exactly that was a literal cold-blooded murder. And for Congress to stop talking about it, we saw a lot of Congress members, posting about it. Oh, this is a tragedy, tragedy, tragedy. But yet these same ones continue to vote for these disastrous bill and this disastrous funding that allows this to continue happening because Alex Preddy is just one of how many to come. We see how many people are dying in these detention or concentration camps, rather, across the country. Dilley Detention Center has seen, an astronomical number of 911 calls being directed from that quote unquote detention center, whatever they try to frame it as. They're not following the right to due process. So why continue funding it? I am older. I was born in 1996. I am older than DHS. DHS was created out of alleged fear. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are as far as ICE funding, DHS,
Yeah.
and also under like DHS is also FEMA. FEMA needs to be its own entity. That is insane to me. That is under DHS. It needs to be broken completely up. ICE needs to be abolished, which abolishing seems like the moderate stance. We obviously need to go a lot further than that. Curious to know what your thoughts are and what ICE has looked like across the state of Massachusetts and what you are seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I've been calling to abolish ICE, and
Mhm.
I've been saying that the people who are violating our laws in the government's name, in ICE, in Customs Border Protection, in the government at large, whether as part of immigration enforcement or as part of other elements of the corruption of this administration, that they need to be prosecuted. I've been saying that since I launched my campaign. I didn't need cold-blooded murders on video to come to that realization. Um, and I do think that that is an important distinction between me and my opponents, who were not calling for those things last last summer, who were not calling for those things last fall. Um, I think that, you know, immigration violations are a civil violation. There should be a process for handling that, but it shouldn't be armed goons. We have a separate process for criminal violations. It's our criminal justice process. And no one in American government has ever said that undocumented immigrants who commit crimes have a right to be staying here. I'm not aware of anyone in the history of American government who's made that claim. Um, but we want processes to make immigration legal and safe. Um, and yeah, we absolutely have to be um, getting rid of the ways in which these new bureaucracies, as you pointed out, are violating our laws, violating our Constitution. We absolutely have to be cutting off their funding and figuring out a much better way to whatever, to the extent there are any necessary jobs that they were supposed to be conducting, reassigning those elsewhere because these agencies are broken to their core.
Exactly. 100%. That's one of those like mic drop moments. I don't have a mic, but I have a pen. Yeah, it's close enough. But exactly 100% absolutely spot on with that. And grab my notes. Sorry about that. Thinking about that, 2010 was a lot. Okay. It's the midterms. And thinking about that, there was also a disastrous Supreme Court decision that came down that kind of paved where we are now. Citizens United. Citizens United versus FEC. And this allowed a lot of different things to continue trickling in. More corporations, more, super PACs, PAC money, and we still see a lot of this trickle down even to now. We see a lot of APAC influence. We see a lot of, God, it just continues on and on and on and on. You know this, or you wouldn't be running because obviously you see a need in whenever it comes to campaign finance reform. Before we started recording, you were talking about how you have 100 plus counties across Massachusetts, which is a lot. It doesn't look like it's that big of a state, but I guess it kind of is. Um, but thinking about, campaign finance reform, thinking about, campaigning in general, what your experience has been, and also thinking about adding Citizens United, how do we get there? We have a 6-3 majority Supreme Court. Thinking about that, there are ways that we can go about reforming the way campaigns, function and the way that they run. What are your thoughts as far as how we get there?
Yeah. So my whole campaign is, while Trump's in office, we got to do more to push back. Once we're back in power, we have to start with structural reforms. And campaign finance is one of the three main structural reforms that I identify. So this is one of the main things of my campaign. And how do we go about fixing campaign finance? The long-term goal, the ultimate objective, is a constitutional amendment that explicitly overturns Citizens United and says that money is not speech, that only human entities have our speech, that corporations are not people. You want to have that expressly written into the Constitution. That is the long-term goal. But that is a hard objective. Constitutional amendments are difficult and take time. We need to be able to make a lot of progress on the way there. How do we make progress while we are working towards that long-term objective? Well, the first thing we need to do is to one of the other core elements of structural reform is we do have to expand the court. We can, people in this country can make a choice. We can adhere to the religion of nine, or we can say we want to fix our environment. We want to improve our health care. We want to, reform, put regulations, enforce monopolies, and anti-monopoly reforms. We can have one or the other. We can adhere to the religion of nine, which is only, like 150 years old. The Supreme Court has had different numbers over time. It was 8 for an entire year in 2016. Or we can make progress. So we have to fix the court, and part of fixing the court is expansion, so that we are not dealing with a 6-3 conservative partisan captured court that we have right now. But again, there are other things we can do even while we're working on that. So we can fund the FEC. Obviously everything, good rule of thumb is things are probably worse under Trump than they were under Biden or Obama. But even under Biden, the FEC was not fully funded. And we were not doing a good job of enforcing the limited campaign finance laws that are already on the books. The rules against cooperation between campaigns and super PACs were really not enforced. We need to enforce those protections, enforce the laws that exist. And you do that by funding the FEC and giving it teeth. We can pass laws to improve disclosure requirements so that while there is massive money moving around, at least it's in the light and is exposed. We can end dark money. Those are two things we can do right now while we are working towards the longer term goals of fixing the court and overturning Citizens United. Because we absolutely have to do those other things, but we don't have to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We can make progress right now.
And we need to get the people in that are actually willing to do that and not, bend at the knee for these corporations and these big pharmaceutical companies. Like, there's so many things that kind of like go into this, which Citizens United led directly to
Absolutely.
everything. It was a disastrous
There,
decision.
there, to hop in for a sec, there are so many examples. I focus so much on structural reform, and sometimes people will say, but Alex, the hot buzzword is affordability, and you don't center that in your campaign. The affordability crisis, the cost of living crisis, that is structural reform.
Yep.
If you, the affordability crisis is driven almost entirely by the cost of housing and the cost of healthcare. How are we going to make real progress on the cost of healthcare and on housing, on increasing the availability of housing, driving housing costs down, if we don't address the structures that are blocking progress in those two ways? A really great example, just because it's so clean. A couple of years ago, there was a bipartisan short-term rental bill before Congress. It had co-sponsors, Republican and Democrat, to regulate Airbnb, VRBO, stuff like that. And it died in committee the same year that Airbnb increased its political giving tenfold. You know, this isn't the biggest driver of the housing costs, but it is a driver, and this is one way and a really clear example in which money in politics directly killed a bill that would have helped with housing costs.
Mhm.
Campaign finance is housing costs.
It's
Campaign
also a
finance
policy
is
choice.
healthcare costs.
And it's all a policy choice. It
Everything,
literally is.
everything's, yes.
And everything is a policy choice because that's what Congress does. They create policy. I mean,
Yes.
it's literally common sense, Alex. You know this. I know that.
Yes.
We just need Washington to understand that. And it also like trickles down into the states. It trickles down, which is why every single election absolutely matters.
Hmm.
And whenever we think about democracy, Mr. Beat here in Kansas is endorsing candidates like all
Hmm.
across the country that is talking about uncapping the House. Now, obviously, I think this is a fantastic way of having our representatives represent the people. One representative should not be representing 700,000 plus constituents. That is insanity. I know my email goes off the rocker. My cell phone is like Grand Central Station. I cannot imagine what they are facing. Those staff members, it is insane, right?
Hmm.
So uncapping that house would expand, the 435 on the house side. And then I think this is just literally just the house side is like the
Yeah.
uncapping. Obviously, there's more that we can do on like the Senate side. Like it's just one of those like things. But just thinking about this, would you support uncapping the house to expand it to represent more to have more like fair representation. Obviously, we see gerrymandering across the country. I live in Kansas. I grew up in Missouri, notorious
Yeah.
for that. If you look at the makeup of the congressional districts, it's insane.
Yeah.
It's just insanity. But what are your thoughts on like uncapping the
Yeah.
House and like expanding further? Obviously, you're running for
Sure.
U.S. Senate. Doesn't directly apply to
Yeah.
you, but
No,
it kind
no,
of
we would
does.
have to vote on it. I would support uncapping the House. Uh, I think that the most logical way to do it would probably be to raise the cap, not to uncap entirely. But the notion
Yes.
that 435 was arbitrarily chosen for a dramatically smaller population a long time ago, logically sound. Um, you know, I think about structures and how they work and how do we incentivize the outcomes that we want. And uncapping the house and leaving the rest of the system in place, you can achieve a lot of goals. You can achieve more direct representation in that way, but you do also leave yourself open to more gerrymandering. And so, you know, pie in the sky ideal set of reforms. Um, I think that if you actually pair uncapping the House with multi-member districts and single transferable vote, sometimes called proportional ranked choice voting, uh, that is a way in which you almost gerrymander proof through the system. It is a big change from how most people are used to thinking about American government, but this is a system that exists elsewhere in the world. It is actually how, here in Massachusetts, Cambridge elects their city council and school boards. It is a system in which you end up leaving the door open to atypical candidates, third party candidates, better representation. If you have a state where, hypothetically speaking, you consistently get 70% Democratic vote and 30% Republican vote, you are more likely to end up with a roughly 7-3 split than
Mhm.
the hypothetical 9-0 split, which enacted nationwide, you get better representation. You are more likely to, if you have 14% of the population that is black, you are more likely to get towards 14% of the population in the House being black. It is so pie in the sky ideal goals. That is sort of, I think, the net combo that would work best because it is more gerrymandering proof when you have multi-member districts, single transferable vote, ranked proportional ranked choice voting, whatever you want to call it, um, and uncapping the House. But even if all you do is just uncap the House, that is something that has a lot of benefits. But again, you want to make sure you're pairing it with a federal law to uh, explicitly prohibit partisan consideration in redistricting.
It's one of those topics that there needs to be a lot of thought into it. And there's a lot of
Mhm.
things to get to before reaching that specific point to the safeguards and the
Yeah,
guardrails
exactly.
obviously need to be in place. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Now, pivoting and talking about LGBTQ rights, your incumbent has been really good whenever it comes to LGBTQ, and I think there's obviously a lot more that needs to be done, right? There's a
Mhm.
lot more that could have been done. They could have already done the Equality Act. They had bipartisan support. They had control over all three branches of government, just like Roe v. Wade. Missed the mark, missed the opportunity. Roe v. Wade was disastrous. And we see what happens whenever it is left up to the states. More states are enacting extreme abortion bans currently at this very moment. So equality is around that same part. We see here in Kansas. Kansas became one of the first states to bar trans people from keeping their driver's licenses that represent who they are. And they sent out over 200 plus like letters saying you either forfeit your license or you need to go and get one that reflects your gender and at birth.
Yeah.
Your gender assigned at birth, your sex assigned at birth. And that is very detrimental. I honestly do not care who is driving a car as long as you do not ram people off the road. If you're not driving under the influence, like that's what I care about. I don't care what
And
the
it's a
people.
poll tax, among other things.
Yes, 100%. And we saw that also with the SAVE Act, right? So thinking about all of this, think about LGBTQ rights. There's also a thing called the Trans Bill of Rights that has also been discussed and been talked about. And we saw what happened with this most recent case that went before the Supreme Court whenever it comes to conversion therapy, specifically Colorado. And I say this as a survivor who went through conversion therapy for 2.5 years. I was not, full disclosure, I was not forced into it. Society told me something was wrong. And obviously scrolling through social media, you see a lot of hate. You see a lot, and not even just for like LGBTQ people, but I live an hour north of Westboro Baptist Church.
Yeah.
Happy to say I've been down to Topeka a couple times, and I may or may not have, said a couple choice words, or may or may not have decided to flip off that church. But my grandfather was an Air Force veteran, and they're going around to military funerals and picketing.
Yeah.
Free speech applies both ways. So I was like, fuck it, I'm going to do it anyway. But thinking about LGBTQ, what are some of the things that you propose as far as safeguards and protections of marginalized communities?
Sure. I mean, step one is we can't back down from our support for these communities at any point in time. Um, Senator Markey obviously is better than most of his peers in Congress on LGBTQ plus issues. But that is an incredibly low bar. And he was as guilty as the rest of the Democratic Party of retreat after the 2024 election. He was silent when my other opponent, Representative Moulton, made his hateful comments about trans people following the election. Senator Markey's whole campaign against the budget bill last summer was focused on the impact of the Medicaid cuts. And not once during that entire campaign, not once during any press conference, not once during any social media post, did he acknowledge that those cuts were slated to remove Medicaid care for trans children and trans adults. Um, he was as guilty as the rest of the party on of retreat on that issue. Um, yes, he is the co-sponsor of a piece of a document that is currently before Congress named a Trans Bill of Rights, and again, that puts him ahead of most of his colleagues. But it is also a non-binding resolution. Why are we doing a non-binding resolution? Is that what we need right now? Don't we need actual legislation to protect these communities? Um, what are we doing here? We need to not be retreating because we're afraid of political consequences. We need to be proposing actual laws that will protect and help these communities. And not only do we need to be protecting this community that we were talking about right now, but when we retreat on the LGBTQ plus community, when we retreat on immigrants, we are signaling to everyone that we are an unreliable ally. We are signaling to everyone that we, the Democratic Party, are not worthy of support because we might back off if we view you as, politically maybe not helpful. So we need to be advocating for every groups that support us and groups that don't support us, because that should be what our party stands for. We should be the party that you can count on to fight for everyone, the party that will fight for workers, the party that will fight for college graduates and people who don't have a high school diploma. Even though the people who don't have a high school diploma don't vote for us as often, we should be the party that you can count on will be there to support you and to defend you when you are under attack. And I don't think that we are the party that has done that. And I think that, yes, Senator Markey has been better than much of his peers with regards to the LGBTQ plus community, but I do not feel that he has met the bar for what is needed in this community in particular.
Thinking about the Democratic Party and the DNC leadership at this very moment, do you feel, as this goes beyond Senator Markey, right? This is a literal complex issue. Do you feel that the DNC leadership is currently meeting the moment?
No.
That's obvious, or we wouldn't have these campaigns running across the country
Right.
challenging popular, or, allegedly popular incumbents.
Mhm.
Thinking about that, I do not feel that they are either. I don't, I, it's one of those things like we have rhinos and dinos, that are literally in the name only, Democrat in name only and Republican in name only. And it's like they've lost the sense of like people because of like that money in politics. They get in, and I didn't realize how much influence there actually was until I started working around candidates and talking to candidates. This is a widespread issue, and
Mhm.
it's literally top of everybody's platform is this campaign finance reform. Before we started recording, you were talking about what you have been experiencing while trying to even get your petitions. Can you kind of talk about that just for a brief moment? You mentioned that receiving phone calls from like county clerks. And I'm sure this
Yeah,
isn't just in your area. I'm sure everybody's experiencing this
yeah,
because one, it's very costly to even get on the ballot, to even run for office. Plus all the other finances that you have
yeah,
as far as running a campaign. Talk about what your experience has been like a little
yeah.
bit, and then I have a couple more questions, and then we'll.
Yeah, I mean, the system is in many ways designed to make it hard for an outsider to run for office. That happens with, uh, there are some places where that happens explicitly. There are candidates who around the country who I've spoken to who have been told explicitly not to run, or who have been told that the state party will do nothing to support you even after they've won their primary. That is happening. Yeah, I'll say it in North Carolina right now. There is at least one Democratic congressional candidate who won the primary, and the state party is not helping or acknowledging even when the state party is holding events in that candidate's district. Um, I have not experienced that level of overt pushback, although I have experienced some softer levels of pushback against running. Um, and there are just institutions that make it really difficult to run and to get on the ballot. To get on the ballot in Massachusetts, I need 10,000 certified signatures. Every single signature has to get handed into the town clerk of the town in which you're registered to vote. So if you're from Cambridge, your signature goes to Cambridge. If you're from Springfield, your signature goes to Springfield. If you're from Falmouth, your signature goes to Falmouth. Um, so I've got signatures from, at last check, over half of the 351 towns across the state. But that means we've got to get to over half of the town clerk's offices to hand these in. Um, and when you've got millions of dollars in the bank and you've got a paid staff that numbers in the dozens, that's a lot easier than when everyone who's working on the campaign is a volunteer. And they have their own jobs and lives that they have to
Mhm.
also manage. Um, then, in order to stay on the ballot, I have to get 15% of delegates at the convention. Massachusetts is, I believe, the only state in the country where you have this dual threshold for statewide candidates, where you need a large signature number and you need to meet a threshold at the convention. So there are these systems that are really designed to make it difficult to get on the ballot. Uh, just to time out for a second while we're talking about signatures, we are coming up on the deadline, and if anybody can help with those, we absolutely do need help. We are on track to get there, but we are on track to be much closer than we wanted to be. And so, really could definitely use signatures. Please check out my website, alexrikleen.com, and reach out if you are able to collect, even if all you're able to do is get 5 to 10 signatures. Every little bit helps. Okay, back to your question.
I love
Um,
it. I love the shameless plug.
yeah,
I love
sorry, I
that.
need it. I need it. I'll make another one before we're done. Uh, so, and there are, and it's not just the party. There are all of these groups that you think of as allies of the left that don't even consider candidates sometimes. That you know, I was talking to another candidate recently. This has happened multiple times throughout New England, where members of the DSA were they went to the DSA to say, "Hey, I would love your support." And instead, the DSA turned around and said, "Actually, we're revoking your membership because you started this campaign without asking for us for permission first." Like, what? Aren't you supposed to be our allies? We're running from the left of the current incumbent. Aren't we an improvement? How are you advancing your own goals here? And the DSA is not the only organization to do something like that. You also then have just the institutional media, which shuts out candidates entirely. Um, the Boston Globe in Massachusetts has taken to describing this race as the Markey Moulton race. They don't call it the Massachusetts Senate primary. They don't say like the race headlined by Markey and Moulton. They call it the Markey Moulton race. I'm here. Hi. I've consistently polling in the high single digits. That's not nothing. Um, I especially when you consider my budget compared to their budgets and my name recognition compared to their name recognition, this isn't one poll. It's like four polls in a row now. Um, And I'm not the only other candidate. There's a Republican. There's a socialist independent. There's another independent who was running as a Republican before the current Republican candidate purchased the primary, which is a whole separate act of corruption. Um, I'm not exaggerating. Not exaggerating at all. Quick aside, because it's really important that we don't lose track of the general election here. What was happening here in Massachusetts is there was a candidate running for the Republican nomination for Senate here in Massachusetts, and they had raised money. They had raised a couple tens of thousands, I think $40,000. And then this much wealthier guy who had run for office before, John Deaton, um, he came in and said, "I want to run for Senate. And this would be a lot easier if the party just endorsed me early and I didn't have to deal with this pesky primary problem." And the state GOP in Massachusetts had a huge debt that was really causing problems for the state party. And I'm sure it's a total coincidence um, that the state party voted to endorse this Republican, John Deaton, early so that he could have access to money and state infrastructure early. And he then wrote some massive checks to the state party to pay off most of their debt. He literally purchased a contested nomination. It is just overt corruption. So sorry. It's important that we not. While I criticize Senator Markey and Representative Moulton, there is no question here as to there. We should never take our eyes off of the what what's happening on the other side of the aisle as well. We need better Democrats, but better Democrats are still, or worse Democrats are better than Republicans, at least in 2026 America.
And in hindsight, yes, 100%. And oftentimes they act alike. Sometimes you can't tell the difference because they support the exact same thing. They talk about the exact same talking points. And Seth Moulton is no exception to that. Anyways, and there's a lot more that goes into
Yeah.
my opinion about Mr. Moulton, but I'll keep it to myself because we do not have time for me to go on that rampage. Thinking about the Voting Rights Act, John Lewis, former, rest in power. John Lewis spent a lot of his career advocating for voting rights. He was on the front lines. He advocated. He's somebody that I deeply admire, somebody that I have always looked up to. But think about the Voting Rights Act, and then also a lot that kind of like goes into it. How do we expand voting rights, and also because we're still battling these exact same issues, right? We see that with the SAVE Act. Luckily, it sounds like the SAVE Act is dead for now, for the time being. But it doesn't mean that they're not going to try again. It doesn't mean that they're not going to try to do some other rigorous bold, well, doesn't mean that they're not going to continue to try. But what
Yeah.
are your thoughts about like voting rights are concerned, and
Yeah.
how do we make it easier for people to vote?
So that's the third staple of my structural reform agenda
Mhm.
is the court, campaign finance, and voting. Um, and when you talk about voting rights, you got to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. You got to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, or the stronger precursor bill before it sort of got a little bit watered down. Um, stronger bills great. We got to pass that. To pass that, we're going to have to get rid of the filibuster. We can't we've got to talk about the structures that block progress. And one of the structures is the Supreme Court, which is actually it seems about to finish gutting the Voting Rights Amendment or the Voting Rights Act just because they want to. Uh, but that speaks to the point that we're getting at here. If we want to protect voting rights, we can't leave in place a partisan captured court that just arbitrarily declared racism is dead and the Voting Rights Act is over because they felt like it. That's not going to work. We have to fix the court so that we can pass these bills and make sure that they stick and make sure that they last. Um, Part of passing them is going to mean getting rid of the filibuster. The filibuster is a relic. It has been mostly used uh, by uh, supremacists to harm minority communities. That is not exclusively the case, but that is the majority of how it has been used historically. Uh, and the reality of our current situation and the goals of the Republican Party versus the goals of the Democratic Party is the Republican Party wants deregulation, which it can achieve through the courts, and it wants tax reform, which it can achieve through reconciliation with 51 votes. Um, the Democratic Party wants to solve big, bold problems, which requires overcoming a filibuster. The reason that Republicans have not gotten rid of the filibuster so far under Trump is because they understand this basic reality that the filibuster harms the idea of progressive goals much more than it harms the idea of conservative goals. So it has a institutionally racist history. It blocks progress. It hurts progressive goals more than conservative goals. And the main argument that people use in favor of the filibuster is that it promotes bipartisanship, but the actual evidence says the exact opposite. There are no states that have anything like a filibuster, and there is more collaboration, more cross-party collaboration in every state than there is in the United States Senate. So there is no good reason to keep the filibuster. We're going to have to get rid of it so that we can pass these voting rights that protect ensure veterans have the right to vote, ensure that disabled people have the right to vote, ensure that minorities have the right to vote, and that they are not getting, culled from the registries in southern states. We have to protect that.
Absolutely, and we saw some shenanigans. I don't think anybody says that anymore, but I'm gonna go ahead and say it anyway.
No,
We saw some
shenanigans is a great
shenanigans
word.
happen in Illinois and then also Texas with their primary elections, and just kind of like seeing a lot of people being turned away for like ridiculously bullshit reasons, right? And it's like literally, your address is off by like one number, or and like even like a lot of people have like on their driver's license, they updated their address like slowly off by one number. Slip up happen, and there's just a number of God. There's a lot of fuckery that goes on, for lack of better term, but it's true.
Hmm.
Speaking of which, you would think that accountability for law enforcement, this kind of brings me in and talk about like my next thing is the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act of 2025.
Yeah.
It was introduced and literally made like no progress, like at all. So thinking about what this bill would do, one, it enhances existing law enforcement mechanisms to remedy violations, and this is directly off of congress.gov, Bill number 5361. It's a House resolution, and it enhances existing enforcement mechanism to remedy violations by law enforcement. Among other things, it does the following. One, lowers the criminal intent standard from willful to knowing or reckless to convict a law enforcement officer for misconduct in a federal prosecution, and limits qualified immunity. And there's more that goes into this. It also grants administrative subpoena power to the Department of Justice in pattern or practice investigations. This is a framework to prevent and remedy racial profiling in policing. What's your thoughts on the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act? And would you support that? I know that criminal justice is a huge aspect of our country. The system is beyond a lot of different reforms, and
Yeah,
it's functioning exactly how it was designed to harm marginalized communities.
yeah.
Black and brown are disproportionately um, disadvantaged whenever it comes to this justice system. I watched a documentary, and I've talked about it a couple of times, called The Alabama Solution, and it was by inmates that are currently incarcerated for various reasons in Alabama, and they continue to profit off of that. The state does, and there's a lot of implicit bias, a lot of excessive force. Me and my mom both watched that documentary, which is available, I believe it's on HBO Max, and it is insane to me that 2026 we're still having these conversations. This should be literal common sense, right? But what's your thoughts on this act, but also policing? And because Massachusetts is no stranger whenever it comes to injustices
Yeah.
with police and excessive force.
Yeah, I mean, we have the disparities are known. They're obvious. We need to make we need to make progress to improve them. I when you work in government, the standard should be higher. The standard that you are held to should be higher. Um, and I am fine with, trying to work with police unions and trade pay raises for something like this. Like I'm fine with trying to come up with solutions to get this across the board, but we can't just keep having the same conversation about the need for criminal justice reform for, it's been an issue towards the forefront, or at least close to the forefront of American politics, at least for what, 14 years, if not longer. And for many, it has been a central issue in their lives much longer, but that's really sort of when it bubbled into more widespread conversation. And this, like everything else, we have not been able to make meaningful progress. And I just think about why. Why aren't we making progress? And I come back to money in politics and people, especially Democrats, because Democrats are the ones we count on to be the good shepherds of good governance, being too afraid about winning re-election as opposed to making the right decisions for their population. Um, and you know, I think that those are kind of the guiding reasons we haven't been able to get there.
And it's also a common factor that if you represent your constituents, you won't have to focus very hard on your reelection. Because if you're representing people and you're showing them, like, this is what I'm going to continue doing, you should have no issue being reelected. And there may or may not be or may or may not be, competition for you, like to
Yeah.
run against you. If you do the right thing the first time, you wouldn't have an opponent in your election. It's literal common sense, something that a lot of people lack. And I'm realizing that, like I said, the more I talk to candidates across the country, the more I see has gone south. It's gone wrong, and it's not right. It's not democracy. So we need to bring integrity into politics.
If you've been in politics for 50 years,
longer than I've been
like
alive.
like Senator Markey has been, or even if you've been in Congress for 12, like Representative Moulton. How can that not change how you think about solving problems? How can that not change your perspective on what's achievable? How could it not? I again go back to my background as a teacher. I, Talk to a teacher in their fifth year versus a teacher in their 20th year and ask them how often they're coming up with new lesson plans. The teacher in their 20th year has got a lot of skills that the teacher in their fifth year doesn't have. The teacher in their 20th year has a lot of things going in their favor that the teacher in their fifth year doesn't have. But the teacher in the fifth year is probably still doing a lot more experimenting, doing a lot more trials. Um, and right now, for the situation we are in right now, we need more boldness. We don't need people who've been around for a long time and haven't gotten enough done while they were there. We need bold action. We need creative problem solving. I, I would love to get back to a place where the skill set acquired through a decade and a half is preferred, but I don't think that's where we are right now.
I think we're far from it. But I do feel a little, I feel a sense of optimism knowing that there are candidates like you that are running that understand about grassroots, that understands about getting money out of politics, that understands the need for obviously campaign reform, campaign finance reforming. And speaking of campaign finances, how can people, I know we're coming up on time here, but how can people contribute to your campaign, follow you on social media, uplift the work that you are doing, and find out more about you?
Yeah,
As I tell all the candidates, whenever this episode comes live, there will be in the description, it'll have, your name, but it'll also have your website, your donate link, and like how people can find you on social media and follow your
yeah,
campaign. It'll all be in that description of each episode, along with this other information, but
sure.
I keep them short and sweet, right to the point. You're a candidate running for U.S. Senate in Massachusetts. That's
Yeah,
what a lot of people need to know, and then they can go in and they can discover and they can look and
yeah,
find out more about you. But
sure.
how can people contribute?
Sure. So, you know, donate link is on my website and it'll be in the show notes. My website is my name, Alex Rikleen, RIKLEEN.US. And look, donations are great. Absolutely, there's a lot of expenses going into a campaign, but right now, what I need even more than that is your time, especially if you live in Massachusetts and are able to help me collect signatures to make sure I get on the ballot. The deadline for that is May 5th, so at 5 p.m. So if you have any time, this weekend or next weekend, reach out. We will get you everything you need as quickly as possible. Even if all you're able to do is get a couple of signatures, every little bit helps as we come up on that deadline. So money is super helpful too. We obviously need a lot of that. The other thing you can do, reach out to the other podcasts, the other social media influencers you want, and tell them you were interested in me and tell them to invite me on. I mentioned earlier that I'm consistently polling in the high single digits. Those same polls are also showing that like roughly 85% of the state doesn't know who I am. So that means about half of the people who know who I am are saying that they want to vote for me. I got to get the word out that I exist. And as we talked about earlier, the larger institutional media has decided to only focus on the bigger names in this race. So if you found anything about what I had to say compelling, reaching out to a show that you listen to and say, "Hey, I'm a regular listener, and I think this guy Alex McLean is a good fit for your show." I mean, Zachary, you can speak to it. That's probably a good way to get an invite, and that would help a lot. So, reach out via the website. reach out to a podcast that you listen to and tell them to invite me on. Follow me on socials. Everything's linked everywhere. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to come on. I really appreciate it. It's great to talk to you. Great to um, talk about how we can try to make things better, how we can solve problems so that we can make things better.
And how do we put America first? And in the actual way of actually putting America first. But yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been an absolute honor to sit down and talk with you. And I look forward to continuing to uplift you
Yeah,
and,
thank you.
advocate for people to find out more about you. And, you have an open invite anytime you have anything else you want to share. Collaborate with us on social media. We always allow candidates from all different areas to collaborate so we can uplift. We built this platform, purely grassroots volunteer ran, 400, almost 400,000 followers across social
Yeah,
media. Like
wow.
we can do some serious
Yeah,
amplification. So obviously that's open to you. That's open to anybody who may be listening. Feel free to reach out. We're here to amplify as much as we can because we cannot rely on the mainstream and corporate media to amplify these stories like Alex's and also amplify the work that you are doing. So again, thank you so much, and I will see you out there.
thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity and the time, and thank you for being willing to squeeze me in on an off schedule, filling in your listeners a little bit. Zachary was really kind to squeeze me in a way that was a traditional form. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.